On the longest night of the year, I set 7 plates on the table and waited for my daughters to come home. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark sea outside, the same beam I'd kept burning for 40 years. By midnight, every plate was still empty. By morning, my phone showed 52 missed calls. None of them were asking if I was all right. They were asking why their bank cards had stopped working. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. At 5:30 on the evening of the 21st of December, when I still believed they might come, the cottage smelled of roast lamb and rosemary. I'd been cooking since noon, following Mary's recipes exactly as she'd written them in the notebook she kept by the aga. Roast leg of lamb with garlic and herbs, roasted potatoes, crispy on the outside, fluffy within, honey-glazed parsnips, Brussels sprouts with chestnuts and bacon, gravy made from the pan drippings, thick and rich and dark. Mary always said the winter solstice was more important than Christmas. The longest night, she called it, the turning point. After tonight, the days would grow longer again, light returning to the world, 1 minute at a time. We'd celebrated it every year since the girls were small, gathering around this same table, lighting candles against the darkness, giving thanks for another year survived. I walked to the dining room and surveyed my work. 7 plates, arranged in a careful circle. 7 sets of cutlery, polished until they gleamed. 7 napkins folded into neat triangles, the way Mary had taught me. 7 wine glasses, waiting to be filled. The good china, the one we only used for special occasions. White with a thin blue rim, like the sea on a calm day. The candles were ready in their holders. I would light them at 6, when the girls arrived. That was the tradition. We'd watch the flames flicker as darkness fell outside, and Mary would read a poem about light returning. The same poem every year. I knew it by heart now, though I'd never been one for poetry before I met her. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 5:45. 15 minutes. They would be arriving soon. Cars pulling into the gravel drive, doors slamming, voices calling out, "Victoria first." Probably. Always punctual. Then Elizabeth, rushing in with apologies about traffic on the M5. The others would follow, filling the house with noise and chaos and life. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. That was fine. They were driving. They wouldn't text while driving. I'd raised them better than that. Through the window, I could see the lighthouse beam sweeping across the dark water. Start Point had been my home for 40 years. I'd walked that path to the lighthouse thousands of times, climbed those spiral stairs, tended that light through storms and fog and endless quiet nights. The beam swept round every 15 seconds, reliable as a heartbeat. Ships at sea counted on it. Sailors in trouble looked for it. For 4 decades, I'd kept it burning. Now I was retired. 3 years since I'd handed over the keys. 3 years since Mary had died. 3 years of Sundays eating alone. Of birthdays with only cards in the post. Of Christmas dinners where I set 1 plate instead of 9. But tonight would be different. I'd asked them all to come, and they'd all said yes. Victoria from London, Charlotte from Edinburgh, Elizabeth from Manchester, Harriet from Bristol, Grace from Cardiff, Beatrice from wherever she happened to be this month, and Rosemary from Plymouth. 7 daughters, traveling from all corners of Britain, coming home for the solstice. The clock struck 6. I lit the candles. 7 flames dancing in the still air. The lamb rested under foil. The vegetables stayed warm in the bottom oven. The gravy sat covered on the hob. Everything was ready. I walked to the window and looked out at the drive. Empty. No headlights on the lane. No sound of engines approaching. Just the wind off the sea and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. They were probably stuck in traffic. The roads were always terrible this time of year. Holiday traffic. Everyone heading somewhere. I'd give them a few more minutes. I sat down in my chair by the fire and picked up my phone. Still no messages. I typed a quick text to Victoria, the eldest. Always the organizer. Everything ready here. Drive safely. Dad. I watched the screen, waiting for the 3 dots that would show she was typing a reply. Nothing. She was probably driving, concentrating on the road. The fire crackled. The candles flickered. The lighthouse beam swept past the window, round and round, patient and eternal. 6:15. 6:30. 6:45. The lamb was getting cold. The potatoes were losing their crispness. The gravy had developed a skin on top that I'd have to skim off before serving. I checked my phone again. Nothing from Victoria. Nothing from any of them. I called Elizabeth. She was usually the most reliable, the one who always answered. The phone rang 5 times, then went to voicemail. Her bright, professional voice asking me to leave a message after the tone. I didn't leave a message. What would I say? I called Charlotte next. Straight to voicemail. Then Harriet. Then Grace. Then Beatrice. Then Rosemary. 7 daughters. 7 phones. Not one of them answered. The clock showed 7. The candles had burned down a 1/4 inch. The food sat waiting on the table, steam no longer rising from the serving dishes. The lighthouse beam swept past, indifferent. I stood at the window, my forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching the empty drive. The lane beyond was dark. No headlights, no sounds, just the wind and the waves and the patient rotation of the light. That's what lighthouse keepers do, Mary used to say. We wait, we watch, we keep the light burning, even when no one seems to be looking for it. But ships eventually came home. They saw the light and turned towards it. They found their way through the darkness because someone had bothered to keep the flame alive. I'd kept the flame alive for 67 years. For my wife, for my daughters, for strangers at sea I'd never meet. Tonight, the light burned on, but the ships weren't coming. I sat back down in my chair and waited, because that's what lighthouse keepers do. We wait, we watch, we hope, even when hope has started to feel like foolishness. Even when the plates stay empty and the food grows cold and the candles burn down to nothing, we wait. I'd spent 40 years keeping the light burning for strangers. My own daughters couldn't find their way home for one evening. The thought arrived unbidden as I sat by the dying fire, watching the clock tick past 8. I pushed it away, tried to replace it with something kinder. They were busy. They had lives. The roads were treacherous this time of year. There would be explanations. There always were. But the thought crept back, persistent as the tide. I met Mary in the summer of 1982, the year I took the position at Start Point. I was 27, fresh from training at Trinity House, eager to prove myself worthy of a principal keeper's post. She was 24, a newly qualified teacher at the village school, renting a cottage half a mile down the lane. I saw her walking on the cliff path one evening, her dark hair blowing wild in the wind, and I fell in love before I even knew her name. We married the following spring. A small ceremony at St. Peter's in the village, with her parents and mine, a handful of friends, and the lighthouse standing witness on the headland behind us. For our honeymoon, we walked the southwest coast path for a week, sleeping in bed and breakfasts, eating pasties on cliff tops, talking about the future we would build together. Victoria arrived in 1984. I remember holding her for the first time, this tiny creature with her mother's dark eyes, and thinking that I finally understood why the light mattered. It wasn't just about ships and navigation and preventing wrecks. It was about bringing people home. It was about being the fixed point they could count on, no matter how dark the night or how rough the sea. Charlotte came 2 years later, then Elizabeth, then Harriet, then Grace, then Beatrice, then finally Rosemary in 1997. 7 daughters in 13 years. The cottage filled with noise and chaos and life. Dolls on the stairs, Wellington boots by the door, drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like shells. Mary ran the household with the same quiet competence she brought to her classroom, while I kept the light burning through the nights. The girls grew up in the shadow of the lighthouse. They knew its rhythms better than most children knew nursery rhymes. They fell asleep to that pattern, woke to it, lived their entire childhoods within its reach. Victoria used to say she could feel when the light was burning, even with her eyes closed. A sort of pulse, she said. Like a heartbeat. I wonder when she stopped feeling it. The years passed the way years do when you're not paying attention. Victoria went off to Cambridge to read law, brilliant and fierce and determined to make something of herself. Charlotte followed her to university, then into the city, then up to Edinburgh with a Scottish banker named Alistair, who'd never quite warmed to me. Elizabeth chose medicine, long shifts at A&E, always tired, always caring, always somewhere else when we needed her. Harriet became an artist, drifting from gallery to studio to commune, never quite settling. Grace became a teacher, like her mother, quiet and thoughtful, the one I worried about least. Beatrice discovered social media and travel blogging, turning her restlessness into a career of sorts. And Rosemary, my youngest, my baby, became a veterinary nurse in Plymouth, close enough to visit but somehow never quite managing it. They scattered across the country like seeds in the wind. And Mary and I stayed here, in the cottage by the lighthouse, watching the beams sweep across the water, waiting for them to come home. They came less and less often. First it was every month, then every few months, then only Christmas and birthdays, then only Christmas, then not even that. Mary noticed before I did. She always saw things more clearly than me. She'd sit by the window in the evenings, watching the empty drive, and I'd see something in her face that I didn't want to name. They're busy, I'd say. They have careers. They have partners. They have their own lives now. They have a father who's still alive, she'd reply. They seem to have forgotten that. I'd brush it off, make excuses, tell her they'd come round eventually. But deep down, I knew she was right. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being their parents and started being their bank account. The phone calls came when they needed money. The visits came when they needed something signed or witnessed or approved. The affection came in waves, shallow and brief, always ebbing away when the transaction was complete. Mary got sick in the autumn of 2022. Breast cancer. Caught late because she'd been too busy looking after everyone else to look after herself. The diagnosis came in October. By November, she was in the hospice. They came then, all 7 of them, arriving in expensive cars, filling the cottage with flowers and tears and guilt. They sat by her bed, held her hand, promised to visit more often, promised to call every week, promised to take better care of their father after she was gone. Mary listened to their promises with a strange smile on her face, like she was hearing a joke, only she understood. On her last night, she asked me to sit with her alone. The girls had gone back to the cottage to sleep, exhausted from the vigil. It was just the 2 of us in that quiet room, the machines beeping softly, her hand thin and cold in mine. "Bobby," she said, "promise me something, anything. When they forget you," she whispered, "and they will forget you. Don't let them take you for granted. Don't let them reduce you to a bank account and a signature. You deserve better than that." I started to protest. "They won't forget," I said. "They're our daughters. They love us." She smiled that strange smile again. "I hope you're right," she said. "But if you're not, you'll know what to do." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. But sitting here now, in this empty house, with 7 cold plates on the table and 7 silent phones, I was beginning to. The fire had burned down to embers. The candles had guttered out, leaving trails of wax across the tablecloth. The lighthouse beam still swept past the window, patient and eternal. But the ships had not come. Mary had known. She'd seen this coming, even as she lay dying. She'd tried to warn me, and she'd left me something. Instructions, she'd called them. A plan. I just hadn't understood what she was asking me to do. Not until tonight. The first text came at 7:30. Then another. Then another. 7 daughters. 7 excuses. Not one apology. Victoria's message arrived first, as it always did. I picked up my phone with trembling hands, hoping for news of traffic delays, of broken down cars, of some reasonable explanation for the empty table. Dad, I can't make it tonight. Massive case blew up at Chambers this afternoon. Client emergency. I'll call tomorrow. No sorry. No happy solstice. No acknowledgement that I'd been cooking all day, that I'd been waiting for hours, that this was the one night of the year I'd asked them to come home. I stared at the message, reading it twice, 3 times. Then, the phone buzzed again. Charlotte, my second eldest. Her message was even shorter. Alistair's parents invited us for dinner. Can't skip it. Family obligation. You understand. Family obligation. The words stung like salt in a wound. What was I, if not family? What were the 7 plates on my table, if not a family obligation? Elizabeth's message came next. Longer than the others. Tinged with guilt, but ultimately, no different. Dad, I'm so sorry. Hospital is short-staffed tonight. 3 nurses called in sick and they need me on the ward. I tried to swap shifts, but no one would take it. I feel terrible. Rain check? Rain check. As if the winter solstice came twice a year. As if my lamb and potatoes would keep until some unspecified future date when she might find time to remember I existed. Harriet's excuse arrived with a photograph attached. A snow-covered lane, trees heavy with white, a cottage in the background, snowed in at Jasper's place in the Cotswolds. Roads completely impassable. Nothing I can do. Stay warm, Dad. I looked out my window at the clear Devon sky. Stars visible. No snow. The weather forecast had mentioned flurries in the Midlands. Perhaps, but nothing that would close roads entirely. I opened Instagram on my phone, something I rarely did, and searched for Harriet's account. Her most recent post, uploaded 2 hours ago, showed her at a gallery opening in Cheltenham, champagne glass in hand, sequin dress. Caption: Winter Wonderland vibes at the Morrison exhibition. Art feeds the soul. Not snowed in then. Simply elsewhere. Simply lying. Simply lying. Grace's message was different from the others. I noticed it immediately. Where the others were brisk, dismissive, already moving on to their real plans, Grace's words hesitated. Dad, I'm so sorry. The children have their nativity play tonight, and I promised I'd be there. I know this is important to you. I know Mum would have wanted us all there. I can't. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Something in her tone made me pause. The mention of Mary. The plea for forgiveness. It felt like more than just an excuse. It felt like guilt. But I didn't have time to think about it, because Beatrice's message arrived next, bright and breezy, and utterly oblivious. Hey, Dad. So sorry. Already in Bali. Brian surprised me with tickets like 2 weeks ago, and we're at this amazing resort. The Wi-Fi is rubbish, but I'll send pics when I can. Have a lovely solstice. Miss you. XXX. 2 weeks ago. She'd known for 2 weeks that she wouldn't be coming, and she hadn't thought to mention it. Hadn't thought to call and explain, to give me time to adjust my expectations. She just left. Flown halfway around the world without a backward glance. I set the phone down. My hands were shaking. 6 daughters. 6 excuses. 1 remaining. Rosemary. My youngest. My baby. The one who lived closest. Just 40 minutes away in Plymouth. The one who used to sit on my knee and ask me to tell her stories about the Lighthouse. The one who cried the hardest at Mary's funeral. Her message arrived at 8:15, after I'd almost given up waiting. Dad, I'm so sorry. Emergency at the clinic. A dog got hit by a car, and I'm the only surgical nurse on call tonight. I'll make it up to you. I promise. Love you. I wanted to believe her. Out of all of them, I wanted to believe Rosemary, but something made me check. I don't know why. Perhaps Mary's voice in my head, warning me. Perhaps 40 years of watching the sea, learning to spot the signs of a coming storm. I opened Facebook, searched for Rosemary's boyfriend, a young man named Daniel whom I'd met twice and neither time liked. His profile was public. His most recent post, uploaded at 7:43, showed him and Rosemary at a dinner table, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. Christmas with the fam. So blessed to have this one by my side. Rosemary was smiling in the photograph. She was wearing the earrings I'd given her for her birthday. She was not at a veterinary clinic, saving a dog that had been hit by a car. She was at Daniel's family dinner, choosing them over me. I set the phone down. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock, and the wind outside, and the distant rhythm of the lighthouse beam. 7 daughters, 7 excuses, 7 lies. Then, at 23 minutes past 9, one final message arrived. Victoria, again. I opened it, expecting another excuse, another demand, another dismissal. Dad, we need to talk about this guilt tripping. We don't owe you our presence just because you're lonely. You need to accept that we have our own lives now. We can't drop everything every time you decide to play the abandoned father card. It's manipulative, and frankly, it's exhausting. We love you, but we need boundaries. I read the message 3 times. Each time, the words cut deeper. Guilt tripping. Manipulative. Abandoned father card. I had asked them to come for dinner. One dinner. One night. The night their mother had considered sacred. And this was her response. This was what my eldest daughter truly thought of me. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the cold glass. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark water. Steady and patient. The same pattern it had followed for over a century. Ships at sea looked for that light. They trusted it. They counted on it to guide them home. But some ships, I was beginning to understand, didn't want to come home. Some ships had found other harbors, other lights, other places they'd rather be, and no amount of burning could bring them back. Mary had warned me. 3 years ago, on her deathbed, she'd told me this would happen. I hadn't listened. I hadn't wanted to believe her, but Mary had always seen things more clearly than me. Mary had always known, and somewhere in this house, she'd left me instructions. A plan. Something she'd prepared for this exact moment. I just had to find it. I found the first letter at midnight, tucked behind the barometer in the hallway. Mary's handwriting. My name on the envelope. I don't know what made me look there. The barometer had hung in that same spot for 30 years, a brass instrument that had belonged to Mary's father, a fisherman who'd trusted it more than any weather forecast. I passed it a dozen times a day without thinking. But that night, something drew me to it. A feeling. An instinct. The same instinct that had told me when a storm was coming. When the light needed checking. When something wasn't right with the sea. I reached behind the frame and my fingers touched paper. Thick paper, the expensive kind Mary used for important letters. I pulled it out carefully, my heart pounding. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with a small sticker in the shape of a lighthouse. Mary had ordered those stickers years ago, used them for birthday cards and thank you notes. Seeing it now felt like a message from beyond, a signal. I carried the envelope to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and stared at it for a long moment. My name was written across the front in Mary's careful script. Bobby. Just that. Nothing else. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were 3 pages, folded neatly, covered in her handwriting. The date at the top read, November 2022, 1 month before she died. She'd written this in the hospice, I realized. Written it while the girls were gathered around her bed, making promises they never intended to keep. My dearest Bobby, if you're reading this, it means the test has failed. It means that on the winter solstice of 2024, not all of our daughters came home. I hoped I'd be wrong. I prayed I'd be wrong. But I knew, Bobby. I knew, even as they sat by my bed and wept and promised to do better. I could see it in their eyes. I had to stop reading. My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and continued. I've done something, Bobby. Something I probably should have discussed with you, but I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. You always see the best in people, even when they've given you no reason to. It's one of the things I love most about you. But it's also why I had to do this alone. 3 years ago, when Father died and left me the inheritance, I told you I'd put it into savings. That wasn't entirely true. I put some of it into savings. Yes, but the rest, along with my life insurance and our joint savings, I placed into a trust. A solicitor in Exeter named Jeffrey Pemberton helped me set it up. He's a good man. You can trust him. The trust contains £750,000. I read the number twice, certain I'd misunderstood. 750,000. I'd had no idea. Mary had always handled the finances, paid the bills, managed the investments. I'd trusted her completely. It had never occurred to me to ask how much we actually had. The trust has conditions, Bobby. Specific conditions that must be met before any of our daughters can receive their share. The primary condition is this. On the winter solstice of 2024, all 7 of them must be present at our cottage by 6 o'clock in the evening for the traditional solstice dinner. All 7. No exceptions. If they meet this condition, the money will be divided equally among them. Roughly £107,000 each. Enough to make a real difference in their lives. But if even one of them fails to attend, if even one of them chooses something else over their father, over our family, over the traditions we built together, then the entire amount goes to the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. Every penny. They'll use it to save lives at sea, which seems fitting. Don't you think? We spent our lives watching over the water. Let our legacy do the same. I set the letter down. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. £750,000. Gone. All of it gone to charity because my daughters couldn't be bothered to come home for one evening. I picked up the letter again, searching for more. There's one more thing, Bobby. One more provision I insisted upon. Even when Mr. Pemberton thought it excessive, you have 10 years from the date of my death to petition the court for redistribution. If, during that time, any of our daughters demonstrates genuine change, not words, Bobby, but actions, not promises, but presents, you can request that her share be released from the RNLI fund and given to her instead. The court will review the evidence and make a determination. This is your power, Bobby. Your choice. I'm not asking you to punish them forever. I'm asking you to wait, to watch, to see which of them, if any, actually means it when they say they love you, and then to reward the ones who prove it. The ones who don't prove it, let them go. You've given them enough, more than enough. It's time to stop being their bank account and start being their father again. If they want a father, they'll have to earn one. I turned to the final page. Mary's handwriting was shakier here, the letters less precise. She'd been tired when she wrote this. Dying. There are more letters, Bobby, hidden throughout the cottage and the lighthouse. You'll find them when you need them. Think of them as breadcrumbs, leading you home. I know this is hard. I know you'll want to call the girls immediately, to warn them, to give them another chance. Please don't. If they can't come home without the threat of losing money, then they were never really coming home at all. They were just performing. And you deserve better than a performance. The light doesn't chase the ships, Bobby. It simply shines. Those who want to come home will find it. Those who don't were never yours to keep. I love you. I've always loved you, and I'm so proud of the man you are. Now go and be the lighthouse. One last time. Forever yours, Mary. I sat at the kitchen table as the clock struck 1. The letter lay before me. 3 pages of my wife's final wishes. Her last gift. Her ultimate act of love. She'd known. She'd known they wouldn't come. She'd known before I did. Before they did. Before any of us could admit what we'd become. and she'd built me a lifeboat. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Tomorrow, I would call Mr. Pemberton. Tomorrow, I would begin. But tonight, I allowed myself one moment of grief. One moment to mourn the family I'd thought I had. The daughters who'd promised to visit and never did. The relationships that had crumbled while I wasn't looking. Then I dried my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and walked to the window. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark water, steady and eternal. Mary was right. The light didn't chase the ships. It simply shone. And now, finally, I knew what to do. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I had a list. 40 years of lighthouse keeping had taught me the value of procedure, of checklists, of doing things in the proper order, step by step, so nothing was missed and nothing went wrong. This was simply another procedure, another checklist, another light to tend. At 8:30, I made the call. Pemberton and Associates. How may I help you? My name is Robert Thornton. I believe your firm holds documents concerning a trust established by my late wife, Mary Thornton. A pause. The sound of typing. One moment, please. Mr. Thornton, I'll put you through to Mr. Pemberton directly. The hold music was Vivaldi. Mary would have known the piece instantly. She'd played piano as a girl, kept a small upright in the sitting room that none of the daughters had ever learned properly. Mr. Thornton. Geoffrey Pemberton's voice was warm, measured, the voice of a man who'd spent decades delivering difficult news. I've been expecting your call. You have? Your wife was quite specific in her instructions. She said you'd ring on the 22nd of December, 2024, or shortly thereafter. She was remarkably precise. He paused. I take it the solstice dinner did not go as hoped. Hearing it stated so plainly felt like a blade between the ribs. No, it didn't. I'm very sorry. Mrs. Thornton spoke of you often during our meetings. She loved you a great deal, Mr. Thornton. Everything she did to protect you. I know. What happens now? Now we proceed according to her wishes. The trust conditions have not been met. As of 6 o'clock yesterday evening, your 7 daughters forfeited their claim to the trust fund. The full amount, £750,000, is now designated for transfer to the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. I'd known this already from Mary's letter, but hearing it from a solicitor made it real in a way it hadn't been before. However, Mr. Pemberton continued, there's a 60-day administrative period during which the paperwork is processed. Additionally, you retain discretionary authority for 10 years to petition the court for redistribution should any beneficiary demonstrate genuine change in character and conduct. Mary mentioned that provision. She was quite insistent on it. She didn't want this to be punishment, Mr. Thornton. She wanted it to be a test, a way of separating those who truly cared from those who merely performed caring. Papers rustled on his end. Now, what about the joint accounts connected to your daughters? That's why I'm calling. Mrs. Thornton anticipated this. She included a separate document authorizing you to freeze any accounts held jointly with your daughters, effective at your discretion. The bank has been notified and is awaiting your instruction. Tomorrow, the 23rd. Noon on the 23rd. Very well. I'll notify the bank this morning. He paused. Mr. Thornton, one more thing. Your wife left a verbal message, which she asked me to convey at this precise moment. My heart clenched. What is it? She said, and I quote, tell Bobby that the hardest part is over. He found the letter. He made the call. He's started the journey. Now all he has to do is keep walking. And remind him there are more letters waiting. He'll find them when he needs them. I'll be with him every step of the way. The tears I'd held back all night finally came. I couldn't speak. Mr. Thornton, are you all right? Yes. My voice was rough. Thank you, Mr. Pemberton, for everything. It's my honor, sir. I'll be in touch tomorrow to confirm the account freeze. I rang off and sat there for a long time, Mary's words echoing in my mind. The hardest part is over. Keep walking. I'll be with you every step of the way. I wiped my eyes and looked at my notepad. The accounts would freeze at noon tomorrow. By evening, the girls would know something was wrong. By the day after, they'd be demanding answers. I had 36 hours of peace left. I spent them walking the cliff path, the same path I'd walked for 40 years. The same path where I'd first seen Mary, with her dark hair, blowing wild in the wind. The sea was gray and churning, winter swells rolling in from the Atlantic, breaking white against the rocks below. The lighthouse stood patient and silent on the headland. I thought about what was coming. The phone calls, the accusations, the demands. Victoria would threaten legal action. Charlotte would send Alistair to intimidate me. Elizabeth would try to reason with me, appealing to my better nature. Harriet would weep dramatically. Grace would do something different, though I couldn't predict what. There was something about her messages that troubled me still. Beatrice would be furious once she emerged from her Bali paradise long enough to check her bank balance. And Rosemary, my youngest, would cry and apologize and promise to do better. They would all promise to do better. But promises meant nothing. Mary had taught me that. Only actions mattered. Only presence. Only the choice to show up, year after year, even when it wasn't convenient. I walked until sunset, painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Then, I returned to the cottage, made myself a simple supper, and sat by the window watching the lighthouse beam begin its nightly rotation. Tomorrow at noon, the storm would break. I could feel it coming the way I'd always felt storms approaching, in my bones, in the shift of the wind, in the particular quality of silence before chaos. But tonight, I was ready. Mary had given me the tools, the letter, the solicitor, the authority to act. The light doesn't chase the ships. Tomorrow, I would finally stop chasing. The first card was declined at 7 minutes past 12. Victoria, buying lunch at a pret-a-manger near her chambers in Lincoln's Inn. I know this because she told me later, screaming down the phone about the humiliation of standing at a till with a queue forming behind her while the machine flashed red and the cashier asked if she had another form of payment. But that came later. At the time, I knew nothing. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking tea, watching the clock on the wall tick past noon. Somewhere in London, my eldest daughter was discovering that her card no longer worked. Somewhere in Edinburgh, Charlotte was about to learn the same thing at a boutique in the new town. The dominoes were falling. I simply couldn't hear them yet. My phone rang for the first time at 12:23. Victoria. I watched her name flash across the screen, watched it ring 5 times, then let it go to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. Not yet. She called again at 12:25, then 12:27, then 12:31. Each time, I let it ring through. Each time, she hung up without speaking. By 1 o'clock, I had 11 missed calls. Charlotte's name appeared on my screen at 1:05. Then Elizabeth at 1/4. Then Harriet at 1/2. The phone buzzed and lit up and vibrated against the wooden table, demanding attention like a child throwing a tantrum in a shop. I set it face down and went to make another cup of tea. The calls kept coming. Beatrice rang from Bali at 2 o'clock, which meant it was 10 at night there. Her card must have been declined at the resort, restaurant, or perhaps the spa. Grace called at 2:15. Then again, at 2:20. Then again, at 2:30. Her persistence surprised me. Rosemary's name appeared at 2:45, followed immediately by a string of text messages I chose not to open. By 4 o'clock, I had 37 missed calls. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the notifications with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. Victoria had called 14 times. Charlotte 8, Elizabeth 6, Harriet 3, Grace 4, Beatrice 2. Rosemary had only called once, but she'd sent 11 text messages, each one presumably longer and more desperate than the last. The voicemails began arriving at 4:30. I listened to them in order, sitting by the window as the winter light faded and the lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation across the darkening sea. Victoria's first message was sharp and clipped. "Dad, what the hell is going on? My card was declined at lunch. At Pret, Dad. In front of colleagues. Call me back immediately." Her second message was angrier. "This isn't funny. Whatever game you're playing, it needs to stop right now. I have bills to pay." Her third message threatened consequences. "I don't know what you've done, but Alistair is already looking into it. You can't just freeze accounts without proper notice. There are laws." Charlotte's voicemail was colder, more controlled, delivered in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to giving orders. "Father, I've been informed that our joint account has been frozen. I assume this is an administrative error. Please rectify it immediately. Alistair is extremely displeased." Elizabeth sounded worried rather than angry, which somehow made it worse. "Dad, something's wrong with my card. I hope everything's all right with you. Please call me back when you can. I'm concerned." Harriet's message was theatrical, as I'd expected. "Daddy, I don't understand what's happening. I tried to buy supplies for my commission, and the card was rejected. I'm in the middle of very important work. This is an absolute disaster." Grace's voicemail was different from the others. Quiet, hesitant, heavy with something that sounded almost like guilt. "Dad, it's Grace. I got a notification from the bank about the account. I think I understand what this is about. I'm so sorry. Please call me. I need to explain something." Beatrice's message crackled through a poor connection, her voice thin and distant. "Dad, the hotel says my card is frozen. I'm literally stuck in Bali with no way to pay for anything. This is absolutely insane. You need to fix this right now." Rosemary's voicemail was the hardest to hear. She was crying, her voice breaking on every other word. "Daddy, please, whatever I did, I'm sorry. I know I should have come for solstice. I know I lied about the clinic. I'm so sorry. Please don't punish me like this. Please just talk to me. I love you." I set the phone down carefully on the windowsill. The clock showed 6 o'clock. Outside, darkness had fully fallen, and the lighthouse beam swept its eternal arc across the black water. I counted the missed calls one final time. 52. 52 calls in 6 hours, and not a single one of them had asked if I was all right. Not one had expressed concern for my well-being before demanding to know about the money. They had called about frozen accounts and declined cards and the inconvenience of being cut off from funds they had always assumed would flow forever. They had called about themselves. That told me everything I needed to know. I thought about Mary's words in her letter. "The light doesn't chase the ships." For 3 years, I had chased. I had called and invited and hoped and waited, and they had stayed away, circling distant harbors, never bothering to look for the light I kept burning. Now the light still burned, but I had stopped chasing. Tomorrow, they would come, not because they wanted to see me, but because they wanted answers. They would arrive with demands and accusations and threats. The storm was here. I could feel it pressing against the windows, but I was ready. I read through the messages that evening, sitting by the window as darkness settled over the sea. 106 texts had arrived since noon. I opened each one carefully, the way a doctor might examine wounds, cataloging the damage with the professional detachment that 40 years of lighthouse keeping had taught me. Victoria's messages formed a clear trajectory from irritation to unbridled rage. Her first text, sent at 12:11, maintained a thin veneer of civility. "Card, declined. At Pret, please check account status immediately." By mid-afternoon, the mask had slipped considerably. "This is absolutely unacceptable behavior from you. I expect an immediate explanation for this nonsense." By evening, she had abandoned all restraint entirely. "I've spoken with Alistair's legal contacts about this situation. What you've done may well constitute financial abuse under current law. We're coming tomorrow morning. 17 messages in total from my eldest daughter. Not one of them contained the words, "Are you all right?" or "Is something wrong with you?" The closest she came to expressing any concern was asking whether I had completely lost my mind. Charlotte's messages were sparse and clinical, as cold as Edinburgh in winter. 5 texts, each one shorter and sharper than the last. Account frozen. Explain yourself. Then, Alistair is extremely displeased by this development. Legal options are currently being explored. Then, arriving tomorrow at midday precisely. Have all relevant paperwork ready for review. Her final message contained just 2 words. This ends. Elizabeth sent the most messages after Victoria. 9 texts in total, each one longer than strictly necessary, circling around the central point without ever quite landing on it directly. Dad, I'm genuinely worried about you. This behavior isn't like you at all. The bank confirmed the freeze was authorized by the primary account holder. I simply don't understand any of this. Are you perhaps having some kind of episode? Should I be genuinely concerned about your mental state? Please just call me back, and we can sort all of this out together properly. She mentioned my well-being, which was considerably more than the others had managed. But even her concern came wrapped tightly in the assumption that something must be fundamentally wrong with me, that this couldn't possibly be a deliberate and considered choice on my part. Harriet's messages were pure theater, exactly as I had expected from her. Daddy, I simply cannot believe this is actually happening to me right now. I'm in the middle of the most important commission of my entire career, and now I can't even buy basic canvas supplies. Do you fully understand what you've done here? This could absolutely ruin me professionally. Ruin me. Completely. Capital letters scattered everywhere. Exclamation marks multiplying like rabbits. Drama without any real substance beneath it. Beatrice's texts arrived in broken fragments from Bali, disrupted by distance and poor hotel signal. WTF is actually happening back there? Then, card declined at the resort restaurant. Had to borrow emergency cash from a couple at the next table. Completely mortifying experience. Then, several hours later, Brian is absolutely furious about all of this. Our entire trip is completely ruined now. How could you possibly do this to us? No mention whatsoever of coming home early. No suggestion that she might consider cutting short her tropical holiday. Just pure anger that her Instagram paradise had been rudely disturbed by something as deeply inconvenient as her own family. Rosemary's messages stood entirely apart from all the others. Where her sisters demanded and accused and threatened, my youngest daughter simply apologized. Dad, I'm so genuinely sorry. I lied directly to you. I wasn't at the veterinary clinic that night. I was at Daniel's family dinner instead. I deliberately chose them over you, and I absolutely hate myself for making that choice. Please don't completely give up on me yet. I know full well I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I love you so much, Daddy. Please respond. 11 messages sent over the course of 4 painful hours, each one heavy with what seemed like genuine remorse. She was the only daughter who had admitted her lie, without first being directly confronted about it. The only one who appeared to understand that this situation was about something far more important than merely frozen bank accounts. I set her messages aside carefully, feeling something soften slightly in my chest, despite everything that had happened. Rosemary had always been the baby of the family, the one most likely to cry openly, the one who wore her vulnerable heart permanently on her sleeve. Then I opened Grace's messages, and suddenly, everything changed completely. 4 texts only, just 4 brief messages. But they entirely rewrote everything I thought I understood about that night and the days that followed. Dad, I received the bank notification this afternoon. I think I understand what this is actually about. Mum told me everything before she died. About the test she'd arranged. About what would happen to everyone if we didn't come home. I should have told them all immediately. I should have made them properly understand the consequences. I'm so deeply sorry. This is entirely my fault. I read those words again slowly, then again, then a third time, feeling each individual sentence land like a heavy stone dropped into perfectly still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Grace had known all along. Mary had told her youngest about the trust fund, about the specific conditions attached to it, about the serious consequences of collective failure. Grace had held that precious knowledge for 3 full years and never spoken a single word of warning to any of her sisters. Why had she stayed silent? Fear of inevitable conflict? Naive hope that it wouldn't ultimately matter? Genuine belief that everyone would simply come anyway, that the test would somehow pass without her ever having to reveal their mother's painful doubts about them? I understood that impulse completely. I'd spent 3 long years hoping for exactly the same thing myself. We'd both been terribly wrong. The lighthouse beam swept steadily past the window, casting brief pale light across the dark room, before returning me to shadow once more. Tomorrow they would descend upon this cottage with their demands, their fury, their tears. I would be ready for them. Christmas Eve morning arrived wrapped in gray light and steady drizzle. The kind of Devon weather that matched a man's mood when he knew war was coming to his doorstep. I woke at 5:30, habit refusing to release its 40-year grip. The cottage felt different, charged, somehow, like the air before a proper channel storm. Today, my daughters would come, not for Christmas dinner, not for their father, for money. I made tea the way I always do. Earl Grey, splash of milk, no sugar. Mary used to say I was the only man in Britain who drank tea like it was a religious ceremony. Perhaps she was right. These small rituals were all I had left of normal life. By 9 o'clock, I had cleaned the cottage twice over, hoovered carpets that didn't need hoovering, polished brass that already gleamed, arranged and rearranged the 7 chairs around the dining table. Nervous energy. Or perhaps I wanted the house to look its best one final time, the way a captain ensures his ship is spotless before surrendering it. The first car appeared at 11:30. I watched from the kitchen window as a silver Range Rover crunched up the gravel drive. Charlotte and Alistair. Of course they would arrive first. Investment bankers never missed an appointment involving money. Charlotte stepped out first, blonde hair perfectly styled despite the drizzle, wearing a cashmere coat that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Alistair followed, umbrella already deployed, expensive shoes picking carefully across the wet gravel. More vehicles followed within the hour. Victoria's black Mercedes, sleek and authoritative, like its owner. Elizabeth's practical Volvo Estate, still bearing a faded NHS Heroes sticker from the pandemic years. Harriet arrived in an Uber, because artists apparently don't drive, wearing paint-splattered jeans that I suspected cost £300 to look that deliberately shabby. Beatrice emerged from Rosemary's modest Fiat they'd traveled together from Plymouth, which surprised me. Sisters who hadn't spoken in 2 years, united now by frozen bank accounts. Grace arrived last, alone in her battered Volkswagen Golf, parking at the far end of the drive as though she might need a quick escape route. She sat in the car for several minutes before finally stepping out, clutching her handbag like a shield. By 1 o'clock, 7 daughters and 1 son-in-law stood in my sitting room. The space had never felt so small, so tense, so full of words waiting to explode. Victoria spoke first, naturally. She positioned herself near the fireplace, like a barrister addressing a hostile courtroom. "Father, you've made your point. Now let's discuss this situation, like civilized adults." "I wasn't aware we were uncivilized," I replied. "This isn't a social call." Alistair stepped forward. Tall, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that comes from managing other people's millions. "I've spoken with our legal team this morning. What you've done with those accounts constitutes financial abuse under the CARE Act." "Alistair." I held up one hand. "I've been a lighthouse keeper for 40 years. I've weathered hurricanes, stood watch through nights that would break most men, and once spent 14 hours keeping the light burning during a generator failure while waves crashed 30 feet over the tower. A man in a 3,000-pound suit doesn't frighten me. Silence. Charlotte placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm. Elizabeth, ever the doctor, tried diplomacy. Dad, we're worried about you. This behavior isn't like you at all. Perhaps we should discuss whether you might benefit from, whether I've gone senile? I smiled. Your mother predicted that approach too. Mum? Harriet's voice cracked. What's Mum got to do with any of this? I looked at each of them in turn. Victoria with her courtroom eyes, already building a case. Charlotte calculating behind her corporate mask. Elizabeth genuinely confused. Medical training, searching for symptoms. Harriet theatrical as always, hand pressed to her chest. Grace staring at the floor, shoulders hunched. Beatrice filming on her bloody phone until Rosemary pushed it down with a sharp whisper. And Rosemary red-eyed, mascara smudged. The youngest and perhaps the most honest of them all. Your mother left something for you. All of you. But there are conditions attached. Conditions? Victoria's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Mum's been dead 3 years. What possible conditions could she impose from the grave? She knew. I rose from my chair and walked to the sideboard. 7 envelopes lay there in a neat row, each bearing a daughter's name in Mary's elegant handwriting. She knew you'd disappear after she was gone. She knew you'd forget your father. She knew, eventually, that money would bring you back when love couldn't. So she planned for exactly this moment. This is absurd. Alistair again. Charlotte, we should leave immediately. Let the lawyers handle this madness. Shut up, Alistair. Charlotte's voice could have frozen the Bristol Channel solid. Even I blinked at the steel in her tone. Perhaps there was more of her mother in her than I'd thought. I distributed the envelopes slowly, deliberately. 1 for each daughter. Cream vellum. Wax sealed with Mary's initial a small M pressed into burgundy wax. The seals were unbroken. 3 years I'd kept them waiting for this moment. Your mother wrote these 3 years ago. When she knew she was dying. She asked me to give them to you. Only when you'd failed her final test. Test? Beatrice looked up from her envelope, confusion replacing her usual self-assurance. The solstice dinner. December 21st. 6 o'clock. All 7 of you at this table. Together. Sharing 1 meal with your father. That was all she asked. That was the single condition of her trust. The silence stretched like a held breath. I watched comprehension dawn across 7 faces, some faster than others. The trust. Charlotte breathed, color draining from her face. The £750,000, gone to the RNLI now. Every penny. Because not one of you could spare 3 hours for your father on the longest night of the year. Rosemary burst into tears. Harriet gasped dramatically. Elizabeth went pale. Victoria's jaw tightened in that way I knew meant she was already planning legal challenges. But Grace simply nodded, as though she'd known all along. Read them, I said quietly. Your mother's final words. Then we'll talk. I walked to the kitchen, giving them privacy they didn't deserve. Through the doorway came the sounds of paper tearing, seals breaking, soft intakes of breath. The lighthouse beams swept past. Faithful as always. Now came the hard part. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching my daughters read their mother's final words. 7 women. 7 envelopes. 7 different reactions unfolding before me like a slow-motion storm. Victoria finished first. She always was the fastest reader, top marks at Cambridge, first-class honors. The daughter who devoured books the way other children devoured sweets. But speed meant nothing now. Her face had gone white as chalk, and her hands trembled as she folded the letter back into its envelope with excessive care. This is manipulative, she said, her barrister's voice cracking at the edges. Even from beyond the grave, she's trying to control us. Mary never controlled anyone, I replied quietly. She simply saw clearly what others refused to see. Charlotte read her letter twice, lips moving silently. Alistair hovered behind her, trying to read over her shoulder. but she angled the paper away from him. When she finished, she pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. For a moment, just a moment, I saw the little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, seeking comfort from the lighthouse keeper who understood storms better than anyone. Mum knew about the Edinburgh account, Charlotte whispered. She knew everything. Elizabeth sat on the sofa, letters spread across her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. The NHS doctor who held dying patients' hands every week, who delivered terrible news with professional compassion, now sobbed like a child. Her letter was the longest. I remembered Mary writing it over 3 separate nights, filling page after page. She wrote about the miscarriage. Elizabeth choked out. The one I never told anyone about. She knew. How did she know? Your mother noticed everything, I said. She saw the sadness in your eyes at Christmas dinner that year. She waited for you to come to her. You never did. Soft one, you created problems. Harriet had thrown her letter onto the floor and was pacing dramatically, arms wrapped around herself. Classic Harriet. Everything was a performance. Even genuine emotion. She called my art, technically accomplished but emotionally hollow. Harriet announced to the room, voice trembling between outrage and devastation. My own mother thought my life's work was hollow. She also wrote that you had more talent than anyone she'd ever known, I said gently. Did you read that part? Or did you stop at the criticism? Harriet's mouth opened, then closed. She retrieved the letter from the floor with shaking hands. Beatrice sat cross-legged on the carpet, phone forgotten beside her, reading her letter with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, genuine reflection. My globe-trotting daughter, always chasing the next adventure, the next photograph, the next viral moment. Mary's letter was short, barely half a page, but each word had been chosen with surgical precision. She said I was running, Beatrice murmured. Running from real connection. Running from anything that might require me to stay in one place long enough to be known. She looked up at me, eyes glistening. Was she right, Dad? What do you think? Beatrice didn't answer. She didn't need to. Rosemary wept openly, making no attempt to hide her tears. The youngest, the one who'd always worn her heart on her sleeve. Her letter was stained with drops before she'd finished the first paragraph. Mum said she forgave me, Rosemary whispered, for lying about visiting last Christmas, for all the excuses. She said she understood that I was afraid of watching her die, because I loved her too much to bear it. She pressed the letter to her heart. How could she forgive me when I can't forgive myself? Because that's what mothers do, I said, my own voice rough with emotion. And then there was Grace. Grace had read her letter in absolute silence, face unreadable. Now she sat motionless, the pages resting in her lap, staring at nothing. Of all my daughters, Grace had always been the hardest to read, the quiet middle child, overshadowed by Victoria's brilliance and Charlotte's ambition, overlooked in favor of Elizabeth's compassion and Harriet's drama. Grace? I stepped closer. Are you all right? She looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not grief, but recognition. Understanding. Mum knew I knew, Grace said quietly. About the test. About the trust. She knew I'd figured it out 3 years ago, when I found the solicitor's letter in her bedside drawer. The room went silent. 6 sisters turned to stare at their sibling. You knew? Victoria's voice could have cut diamonds. You knew about the £750,000 and you didn't tell us? I knew about the condition, Grace replied, meeting Victoria's glare without flinching. I knew what Mum wanted. I tried to organize the solstice dinner 3 times. I sent messages to every single one of you. I begged. I pleaded. None of you could be bothered. That's not. Charlotte started. Check your phones. Grace interrupted. Check your emails. The evidence is there. I did everything I could to bring this family together. You all chose differently. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Grace stood, tucking her letter carefully into her handbag. Mum's letter to me wasn't criticism. It was an apology. She apologized for putting me in an impossible position knowing the truth but being unable to force my sisters to care. She looked at each of them in turn. She also thanked me for trying, for never giving up on this family, even when this family gave up on itself. The lighthouse beam swept past the window. Faithful, constant, unwavering. The money is gone, I said finally. The RNLI will save lives with it. Lives that matter to strangers. Since my own family couldn't be bothered to save what mattered to me. But your mother left something more valuable than money in those letters. Whether you accept it or throw it away is your choice. Victoria stood abruptly. I need air. She walked out. After a moment, Alistair followed, Charlotte trailing behind with a backward glance I couldn't interpret. 4 daughters remained. 4 letters clutched in 4 pairs of hands. The first fracture had appeared. Now, we would see who stayed and who shattered completely. The front door slammed. Through the window, I watched Victoria's Mercedes reverse down the drive with aggressive speed, gravel spraying beneath expensive tires. Charlotte and Alistair followed moments later in their Range Rover. Though Charlotte paused at the car door, looking back at the cottage with an expression I couldn't read from this distance. Then they were gone. 3 years of silence. And now silence again, this time perhaps permanent. I turned back to the sitting room. Elizabeth sat on the sofa, mascara streaked, still clutching her letter. Harriet had stopped pacing and settled into the armchair by the window, knees drawn up like a child. Beatrice remained cross-legged on the carpet, phone untouched beside her. Rosemary perched on the ottoman, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue. And Grace stood apart from the others, watching me with those quiet, knowing eyes. 4 daughters. Out of 7. Better than I'd expected, if I'm honest. Dad. Elizabeth's voice was hoarse from crying. We need to understand. All of it. Not just the trust. Not just the money. Everything. Why did Mum do this? I walked to the sideboard and retrieved a manila folder I'd kept hidden beneath the table linens for 3 years. Inside were documents, letters, photographs, the complete record of Mary's final months. I'd never shown anyone. Never planned to. But perhaps now was the time for complete truth. Your mother was diagnosed in September 2022. I began, settling into my armchair. Stage 4 breast cancer. The doctors gave her 8 months, maybe 12 with aggressive treatment. She chose 6 months of comfort over a year of suffering. We knew that, Harriet said softly. You were there for the final week, I corrected gently. When the hospice called and said it was time, but the months before the planning, the decisions, the long nights when she couldn't sleep for the pain, those months she spent mostly alone. With me, Elizabeth flinched as though I'd struck her. I tried to visit more. The hospital was so demanding. And, I'm not accusing, sweetheart. I'm explaining. I opened the folder and spread the documents across the coffee table. Your mother used those months wisely. She knew exactly what would happen after she was gone. She'd watched other families, friends, neighbors, patients from her teaching days tear themselves apart over inheritance. But it has happened, Beatrice said quietly. Look at us. Victoria just drove away. Charlotte too. The tearing apart was already happening. Grace spoke up. Mum just made it visible. I nodded at my middle daughter, grateful for her understanding. The trust was established in November 2022. Your mother worked with Mr. Pemberton for weeks, getting every detail exactly right. The £750,000 represented everything we'd saved over 40 years. My pension, her teacher's retirement fund, the inheritance from your grandmother, the life insurance, everything, and she gave it all away. Harriet whispered. To the RNLI, only if you failed her test. Which you did. I held up a hand before anyone could protest. I'm not being cruel. I'm stating facts. Your mother gave you the simplest possible condition one evening. 1 meal. All 7 of you together. She gave you 3 years to manage it. You couldn't. The condition wasn't simple, Elizabeth said. Getting all 7 of us in the same room is like herding cats. Victoria's court schedule, Charlotte's banking hours, my hospital shifts, excuses. The word came from Rosemary, surprising everyone. The youngest daughter wiped her eyes and sat up straighter. They're all excuses, Lizzie. I work 60-hour weeks at the veterinary clinic. I still could have come if I'd really wanted to. I just didn't want to badly enough. Silence. Rosemary's honesty hung in the air like smoke. Your mother predicted that too, I said, pulling a photograph from the folder. It showed Mary in her hospital bed, thin but smart, holding a handwritten note. I passed it to Elizabeth. She wrote that the day before she drafted the trust conditions. Read it aloud. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she took the photograph. My darling girls will make excuses. They'll blame work, distance, timing, money, health, weather, traffic, anything except the truth. The truth is that they've forgotten how to prioritize family. They've forgotten that time is the only gift that matters, and once it's gone, no amount of money can buy it back. I pray they learn this lesson before it's too late. If they don't learn it from my death, perhaps they'll learn it from losing their inheritance. And if they don't learn it, then Elizabeth's voice broke. Then perhaps they were never going to learn it at all. Harriet was crying openly now. Beatrice had covered her face with her hands. The RNLI. Grace said thoughtfully. Why them specifically? I smiled, despite the heaviness in my chest. Your mother always said that lighthouse keepers and lifeboat crews understood the same truth, that some lights must keep burning no matter what, and some rescues must be attempted even when hope seems lost. She wanted the money to save lives. Real lives. Strangers, in the dark, crying out for help. Instead of us. Beatrice murmured. You never cried out. I replied. You never asked for help. You never admitted you were lost. The RNLI rescues people who know they're drowning. My daughters were drowning in careers and ambition and distance. But none of you ever thought to signal for rescue. The lighthouse beam swept past the window. 15 seconds of light, then darkness, then light again. There's more, I said, reaching for another document. The cottage. This house where you all grew up. I'm selling it. 4 gasps. 4 pairs of eyes fixed on me with sudden intensity. The cottage isn't part of the trust. It's mine to do with as I please. I've accepted an offer from the National Trust, £620,000. They're going to preserve it as a heritage site. The Thornton Lighthouse Keeper's Cottage. Dad, you can't. Elizabeth breathed. This is our home. No, sweetheart. I met her eyes steadily. This was your home. You left it behind years ago. All of you did. I'm simply acknowledging what's already true. The truth about Mary was finally complete. Now came the aftermath. Now came the aftermath. The sitting room fell silent after my announcement about the cottage. 4 daughters stared at me, as though I'd just told them the sun would stop rising tomorrow. Elizabeth spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Where will you go? Dad. Scotland. The Isle of Skye. I've found a small cottage near Portree, overlooking the sea. It's quiet there, peaceful, a good place for an old lighthouse keeper to spend his remaining years. You've already bought it? Harriet's voice pitched higher with disbelief. Without telling us? I wasn't aware I needed permission from daughters who haven't visited in 3 years. The words came out sharper than I intended. I softened my tone. I'm sorry. That was unkind. But surely you understand this house holds too many memories. Every room reminds me of your mother. Every corner whispers her name. I can't heal here. I need somewhere new. Beatrice nodded slowly, surprising me. That makes sense, Dad. Sometimes you have to leave a place to find yourself again. I've done it a dozen times. Running isn't the same as healing, Grace said quietly. All eyes turned to her. She stood by the window, silhouette outlined against the gray December light, arms wrapped around herself. Sometimes running just means you carry the pain to a new location. Speaking from experience? I asked gently. Grace was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, Her voice trembled with emotion. I'd never heard from my most reserved daughter. I need to tell you all something. Something I should have confessed years ago. She moved to the center of the room, facing her sisters. Elizabeth shifted on the sofa to make space, but Grace remained standing, as though she needed the vulnerability of exposure. 3 years ago, 2 weeks before Mum died, I found documents in her bedside drawer. The trust papers, Mr. Pemberton's letters, everything. Grace's hands twisted together nervously. I read them while Mum was sleeping. I knew about the £750,000. I knew about the solstice condition. I knew exactly what would happen if we failed. You already told us this, Harriet interrupted impatiently. Earlier, you said you tried to organize the dinner. I did try, but that's not the whole truth. Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. The whole truth is that I was relieved when nobody came. Part of me wanted you all to fail. The confession hung in the air like poison. What? Elizabeth breathed. Grace, why would you? Because I was angry. The words burst from Grace like water breaking through a dam. I was so bloody angry at all of you. For years I'd been the invisible one. The middle child nobody noticed. Victoria was the brilliant barrister. Charlotte was the successful banker. Lizzie was the compassionate doctor. Harriet was the tortured artist. Bea was the adventurous traveler. Rosie was the sweet baby of the family. And I was just Grace. Plain, quiet, forgettable Grace. The schoolteacher in Cardiff who nobody ever asked about. Rosemary reached out to touch her sister's arm, but Grace stepped back. Mum was the only one who truly saw me. She rang every Sunday without fail. She remembered my students' names. She asked about my life, my real life, not just the polite surface. When she got sick, I drove down every weekend. For 6 months. 6 months of watching her fade away while the rest of you sent flowers and cards and promises to visit soon. That's not fair. Harriet protested weakly. I came when I could. You came twice, Harriet. Twice in 6 months. And both times you spent more hours complaining about your gallery problems than sitting with Mum. Grace's voice hardened. Charlotte came once and spent the entire visit on conference calls in the garden. Victoria sent her assistant to deliver a fruit basket. A fruit basket. For a dying woman who couldn't eat solid food. Elizabeth was crying again. Beatrice stared at the floor. Rosemary had gone pale. So when I found those trust documents, Grace continued, part of me thought, good. Let them lose the money. Let them feel consequences for once. Let them understand what it means to fail someone who loved them unconditionally. But you still tried to organize the dinner. I said softly. You sent messages. You made calls. Because Mum asked me to. Grace finally let the tears fall. In her last days, when she could barely speak, she held my hand and asked me to try. To give my sisters one final chance. She said that anger was a poison that would destroy me if I let it. She said that forgiveness wasn't about them deserving it. It was about me refusing to carry the weight any longer. She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her handbag, her letter from Mary, now tear-stained and worn. Mum wrote that she knew about my anger. She knew I'd found the documents. She knew part of me wanted revenge. And she forgave me for it. Grace's voice cracked. She forgave me before I even asked. That's the kind of person she was. That's what we lost when she died. I rose from my chair and crossed the room. My quiet middled, I pulled her into my arms, and she collapsed against my chest, sobbing. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I should have tried harder. I should have. I Tom and Domgum. I should have Tom and Domgum. I Tom and Domgum. Shh. I stroked her hair the way I'd done when she was small. You carried an impossible burden alone. That ends now. Over Grace's shoulder, I watched her sisters. Elizabeth wiping tears. Harriet looking ashamed. Beatrice with her head bowed. Rosemary crying silently. Perhaps something was finally breaking open. Perhaps the healing could begin. Or perhaps the worst was yet to come. Grace's confession changed something in the room. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as though a window had been opened after years of stale silence. I could almost feel the walls exhaling. I released my daughter and guided her to the sofa beside Elizabeth, who immediately took Grace's hand. Sisters reconnecting, tentatively, like strangers learning to trust again after years of careful distance. I had no idea, Elizabeth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Grace, I never realized you felt so invisible. I thought you preferred being quiet. I thought you were content in your own world. You thought what was convenient, Grace replied, but without malice. We all did. It's easier to assume someone's fine than to actually ask the difficult questions. Harriet had moved to the window, staring out at the gray December sky where the last light was fading fast. I owe you an apology, she said, without turning around. Several apologies. Actually, you were right about the gallery complaints. I was so wrapped up in my own drama, my own artistic struggles, that I couldn't see Mum was dying right in front of me. We were all blind. Beatrice added quietly from her spot on the carpet. I was literally on the other side of the world, posting photographs of sunsets and temples, convincing myself that distance was the same as freedom. But I wasn't free. I was hiding from anything that required me to feel something real. Rosemary had stopped crying, though her eyes remained red and swollen. She looked younger than her 27 years, vulnerable in a way that reminded me of the little girl who used to bring injured birds home, determined to save every broken thing she found. What do we do now? She asked, looking at me with desperate hope. How do we fix this, Dad? There must be something we can do. I settled back into my armchair, feeling every one of my 67 years in my bones. I don't know if you can fix it, I answered honestly. Some things, once broken, stay broken forever. The trust money is gone, that's final and irreversible. The cottage will be sold, that's already decided. Your mother is dead, that will never change, no matter how much we wish otherwise. The only question remaining is what you choose to do with what's left. What's left is each other, Grace said softly. The words hung in the air. Simple, profound. The kind of truth that sounds obvious until you realize how easily it's forgotten in the rush of daily life, career ambitions, and convenient excuses. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the message from Charlotte. Dad, we need to talk. Alistair is furious, but I've told him to back off. I'm coming back tomorrow. Alone. Please don't sell the cottage until we've spoken. I mean it. I showed the message to no one. Tomorrow would bring its own complications, its own storms. Tonight was for those who had chosen to stay. It's nearly 5 o'clock, I said, glancing at the darkening window where the lighthouse beam had begun its faithful sweep. The sun's setting on Christmas Eve. If any of you want to leave, now would be the time. I won't judge. I won't pressure. But if you're staying, I'll put the kettle on and we'll have a proper talk, the kind of honest conversation we should have had years ago. The moment stretched like elastic pulled to breaking point. I watched each daughter wrestle with her own decision, her own fears, her own guilt. Harriet turned from the window first. Her eyes were red but determined. I'm staying. I've run away from enough difficult conversations in my life. I'm tired of running. Elizabeth squeezed Grace's hand tighter. I'm staying too. I think we all need this, whatever this turns out to be. Beatrice pulled herself up from the carpet and dusted off her designer jeans. I've spent 3 years traveling to avoid exactly this kind of moment. Bali, Thailand, Portugal, Morocco. Anywhere that wasn't here, wasn't home. Maybe it's time I stopped moving and actually faced something that matters. Rosemary simply nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm not going anywhere, Dad. Not this time. I promise. Grace met my eyes with quiet steadiness. I've been staying all along, haven't I? Someone had to keep the light burning. 5 daughters. 4, who had failed the test, plus Grace, who had carried the impossible burden of knowing. 5 out of 7 wasn't perfect, but it was more than I dared hope for when this terrible, wonderful day began. Right then, I clapped my hands together, summoning energy I didn't quite feel. Tea. And perhaps some of those mince pies your mother taught me to make. They're not as good as hers, nothing ever will be, but they're close enough. We moved to the kitchen together, a small migration that felt momentous, like the first steps of a journey whose destination remained uncertain. Rosemary filled the kettle while Elizabeth found the good china that Mary had saved for special occasions. Harriet located the mince pies I'd baked yesterday morning, back when I still believed I might eat Christmas Eve dinner alone with only memories for company. Beatrice set out cups and saucers with surprising domesticity for a woman who'd spent years living out of a backpack. Grace simply stood beside me at the counter, her presence a quiet comfort that required no words. "Dad?" Rosemary's voice was tentative as she arranged biscuits on Mary's favorite serving plate, the one with the hand-painted roses. "Do you think Victoria and Charlotte will ever come back? Really come back, I mean. Not just for legal arguments or fights about money." I considered the question carefully, while the kettle began its slow climb toward boiling. Victoria, with her rigid pride and courtroom certainties, always needing to win every argument. Charlotte, trapped in a marriage to Alistair that seemed more business arrangement than love, her warmth buried beneath corporate armor. I don't know, sweetheart. Honestly, I don't. Your mother's letters might work on them eventually. Truth has a way of burrowing into the heart, even when we try desperately to ignore it. But they have to choose to let it in. No one can force that door open from outside. The kettle whistled. Tea was poured into waiting cups. Mince pies were distributed on small plates. And slowly, carefully, like survivors emerging from a storm, we began to talk. 3 months passed like water through cupped hands, impossible to hold, impossible to stop. January brought ice and silence. February brought tentative phone calls and awkward texts. March brought the letter from Pemberton and Associates, summoning us all to Exeter for the formal reading of Mary's trust. I drove down from Scotland on a grey Tuesday morning, the roads winding through mist and memory. I'd been in the Isle of Skye cottage for 2 months now, learning the rhythms of a different sea, a different sky. The healing had begun. Slowly, like spring pushing through frozen ground. The solicitor's office occupied the second floor of a Georgian townhouse near Exeter Cathedral. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, the smell of old paper and older money. Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton greeted me at the door with a firm handshake and sympathetic eyes. "Mr. Thornton, thank you for making the journey. The others are already assembled." I walked into the conference room and counted heads. Elizabeth sat nearest the window, still in her NHS lanyard from an early shift. Grace occupied the chair beside her, quiet as always, but somehow more present than before. Rosemary perched nervously on the edge of her seat, clutching a tissue. Beatrice had flown back from Portugal specifically for this meeting, her tan fading but her resolve apparently strengthened. And there, at the far end of the table, sat Charlotte, alone. No Alistair, no wedding ring on her finger. Charlotte. I nodded at my second daughter. "You came. I said I would." Her voice was different, softer, less armored. "Alistair and I are separating. He wanted me to fight you for the money. I told him there was nothing left to fight for. I'm sorry about your marriage." "Don't be." Mum's letter made me see things clearly. Alistair loved my income, my connections, my usefulness. He never loved me. Charlotte's smile was sad but genuine. Better to know the truth late than never know it at all. 5 daughters present. 2 still absent, Victoria and Harriet. Victoria had sent a letter through her own solicitor, formally contesting the trust conditions. Harriet had simply disappeared, returning to her Bristol studio and refusing all calls. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and opened a thick folder. "Ladies, Mr. Thornton, thank you for attending. As you know, we're here for the formal reading and execution of the Mary Eleanor Thornton Irrevocable Trust, established November 15th, 2022. He adjusted his spectacles and began reading in the measured tones of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before. "The trust, valued at £750,000, was established with a single condition: that all 7 daughters of Robert and Mary Thornton be present at the family home on the winter solstice of 2024 from 6 o'clock in the evening for a minimum duration of 1 hour. This condition was not met. Therefore, in accordance with Mrs. Thornton's explicit instructions, the full sum of £750,000 shall be transferred to the Royal National Lifeboat Institution within 60 days of this reading. The words fell like stones into still water. We'd known this was coming. Hearing it officially made it somehow more final. However, Mr. Pemberton continued, turning a page, Mrs. Thornton included a secondary provision that I am now authorized to disclose. We all leaned forward. Mr. Robert Thornton retains discretionary power until March 2032 to petition the court for redistribution of trust funds to any daughter who demonstrates, in his sole judgment, a genuine change of character and renewed commitment to family bonds. This provision applies only to the daughters who were present at the formal reading today. Those who chose not to attend have forfeited this possibility permanently. Elizabeth gasped softly. So, there's still a chance? The money isn't completely lost? The £750,000 has been transferred, Mr. Pemberton clarified. That cannot be undone. However, Mrs. Thornton also established a secondary reserve fund of £50,000, held separately, which Mr. Thornton may distribute at his discretion to daughters meeting the criteria outlined. £50,000. A fraction of the original sum, but still significant. Mary had planned for everything, including the possibility of redemption. Victoria and Harriet. Grace said slowly. They're not here. Does that mean Miss Victoria Thornton and Miss Harriet Thornton have permanently forfeited any claim to discretionary funds by their absence today? Mr. Pemberton confirmed. Mrs. Thornton was quite explicit on this point. Second chances require presence. Absence is its own answer. Charlotte wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Mum knew. She knew some of us would come back eventually, and some wouldn't. She planned for both. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Mr. Pemberton said gently. In 30 years of practice, I've never encountered a client who thought so carefully about the future, not just of her money, but of her family's souls. The formal reading continued details about the cottage sale, the RNLI transfer timeline, the legal challenge Victoria had filed, and its likely failure. But I barely heard the words. I was watching my daughters. Elizabeth, taking notes with her doctor's precision. Charlotte, finally freed from a loveless marriage. Grace, the quiet keeper of secrets, now surrounded by sisters who finally saw her. Rosemary, youngest and most vulnerable, already planning how to earn her father's trust. Beatrice, the wanderer, sitting still, for once, 5 daughters, not 7, perhaps not even 6, if Harriet's silence continued. But 5 was more than I dared hope for on that terrible solstice night when I set 7 plates and sat alone. Mr. Thornton? Mr. Pemberton's voice pulled me back. Do you have any questions? I looked around the table at my girls. My imperfect, complicated, human daughters. No questions, I said. I think we finally have the answers we needed. We walked out into the pale March sunlight together. The cathedral bells were ringing noon. Somewhere, a ship's horn sounded from the distant harbor. The formal ending had become an informal beginning. The estate agent's sign went up on a bright April morning. Sold already printed across the wooden board, before it was even hammered into the front garden. The National Trust had moved quickly, eager to preserve what they called a significant example of Devon coastal heritage. I stood at the gate watching 2 young men in matching polo shirts plant the sign beside Mary's rose bushes. 43 years of marriage, 40 years of lighthouse keeping, 7 daughters raised within these stone walls, all reduced to a transaction. A signature, a transfer of deeds, numbers on paper that could never capture the weight of what was being surrendered. £620,000. That was the price of memory. That was the value the world placed on a lifetime. Elizabeth had driven down from Manchester to help me pack. She arrived at noon with her practical Volvo, stuffed with cardboard boxes and rolls of packing tape, her NHS efficiency already calculating how to dismantle a lifetime in a single weekend. She found me still standing at the gate an hour later, unable to move. "We don't have to rush, Dad," she said gently, placing a hand on my arm. "The completion date isn't until June. There's plenty of time to do this properly." Time. I repeated the word as though tasting something bitter. Your mother and I always thought we had more time. Right, until we didn't. That's the cruelest trick life plays, convincing us tomorrow is guaranteed. We started in the attic, where 40 years of accumulated life had settled like sediment at the bottom of a river. Christmas decorations in labeled boxes. Mary's handwriting on every single one. Her neat schoolteacher's script unchanged across decades. School reports from 7 daughters, tied with faded ribbon and sorted by year. Photograph albums too numerous to count, their pages slowly yellowing like autumn leaves waiting to fall. "Dad, look at this." Elizabeth held up a faded photograph, dust motes dancing in the attic light around her. 7 girls in matching dresses, lined up by height on the front step of this very cottage. Victoria scowling at the camera, already displaying the stubborn pride that would define her. Charlotte posing with practiced elegance. Elizabeth squinting at the sun. Harriet pulling faces behind Grace's back. Grace nearly invisible in the middle. Overlooked even then. Beatrice mid-fidget, unable to stand still. I'd forgotten Mum made us wear those awful floral things. Elizabeth laughed through sudden tears. Easter Sunday, 1995. I took the photograph carefully, studying faces that seemed to belong to strangers now, or perhaps to ghosts of who my daughters had once been. She spent 3 weeks sewing those dresses. One for each of you, all from the same fabric. She wanted you to look like a proper family. We were a proper family, weren't we? Once upon a time? Once. I tucked the photograph into my jacket pocket, close to my heart. Before London and Edinburgh and Bristol called you away, one by one. Before careers became more important than Sunday dinners. Before success was measured in salaries rather than time spent together. We worked in companionable silence after that exchange, sorting possessions into 3 piles. Keep, donate, discard. The keep pile remained stubbornly small, refusing to grow no matter how many treasures we uncovered. What did an old lighthouse keeper need in his new life on Skye? Some books that Mary had loved. Some photographs that captured moments worth remembering. Her letters, all 17 of them. The blue-rimmed china she'd inherited from her grandmother, stored above all other possessions. Grace arrived on Saturday morning with Rosemary and Beatrice in tow, their cars forming a small convoy of returning daughters. Charlotte came Sunday morning, pale but determined. Her divorce solicitor's number still glowing on her phone screen from a difficult conversation the night before. She'd chosen family over Alistair's demands. That choice had cost her a marriage, but perhaps it had saved something more valuable. Even Harriet appeared briefly on Sunday afternoon, slipping through the back door like a ghost, retrieving her childhood paintings from the spare room without meeting anyone's eyes. I watched her wrap each canvas with surprising care. The watercolors of Start Point, the oil paintings of the harbor, the abstract pieces she'd created during her angry teenage years. "Harriet, wait." I caught her arm as she headed for the door, canvases tucked protectively under both arms. "You don't have to run away again. I'm not running." Her voice was flat, defensive, the voice of a woman who'd built walls too high to climb. "I'm taking what's mine before strangers pick through everything. Those paintings belong to you. They always did, and no one would deny that. But you belong here too, with your sisters, with me. That hasn't changed. It never will." She met my eyes for the first time since that terrible Christmas Eve confrontation. I saw anger there, and hurt, and something else swimming beneath the surface. Something that might have been regret beginning to bloom. "Mum's letter," Harriet whispered finally. "She wrote that my art was hollow because I painted to escape feeling, not to express it. She said I had more talent than anyone she'd ever known. But talent without truth is just decoration on a wall. And what do you think? She was right. Harriet's voice cracked like thin ice. I've spent 15 years painting beautiful lies. I don't know how to paint truth. I don't know if I ever can learn. Learning takes time and courage. The door's always open, Harriet. Whenever you're ready to walk through it. She left without another word. But she paused at the gate. I watched her look back at the cottage, at the sold sign, at the sisters watching from the window, at the father she'd abandoned and was perhaps finally beginning to remember. On the final packing day, I found Mary's last hidden letter. It was tucked inside the grandfather clock, sealed in an envelope marked, "For Bobby, when the cottage is empty." My hands trembled as I broke the wax seal. My darling Bobby, thank you for 43 years of love. The cottage was never just walls. It was the container for our love. But love doesn't need a container. Find peace in Scotland. I'll be waiting just beyond the horizon, where the light never fades. Forever yours, Mary. I pressed the letter to my chest and wept. The ferry from Mallaig crossed waters so still they mirrored the sky like polished glass. I stood at the bow, watching the Isle of Skye emerge from morning mist. Dark mountains rising like ancient guardians, their peaks dusted with late spring snow. My new home. My final chapter. Skyfall Cottage sat on a hillside above Portree. The island's largest town, though largest, meant little more than a harbor, a high street, and a scattering of painted houses climbing toward the clouds. The cottage itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, a sitting room with a wood-burning stove, and a kitchen window that framed the Quillen Mountains like a living painting. Jim Holbrook met me at the ferry terminal. We'd served together in the Coast Guard 40 years ago, before life scattered us to different shores. Now he was 72, white-bearded, wind-weathered, and the closest thing I had to a friend who understood what lighthouse keeping had meant. Bobby Thornton. He clasped my hand with the grip of a man who'd spent decades hauling ropes and rescue lines. Never thought I'd see you leave Devon. That cottage was your whole world. The world changes, I replied. We change with it, or we break. Jim helped me unload the modest collection of boxes from my hired van books, photographs, Mary's blue-rimmed china. The letters I'd collected from every hidden corner of the old cottage. 17 letters in total, each one a piece of my wife's soul preserved in ink and paper. You'll like it here, Jim said, as we carried the last box inside. The island has a way of healing people. Something about the light, the silence, the sea. Wounds that won't close anywhere else somehow knit themselves together on Skye. I hoped he was right. The wound of Mary's death had never fully closed. Perhaps it never would. But the wounds my daughters had inflicted, the years of absence, the excuses, the slow erosion of family bonds, those I hoped might eventually scar over. The first week passed in simple routines. Morning tea on the small porch, watching fishing boats leave Portree Harbor. Afternoon walks along the coastal path, learning the names of unfamiliar wildflowers. Evening meals cooked slowly, eaten alone, accompanied by Radio 4 and the distant bleating of sheep. Loneliness had a different texture here than in Devon. There, every room had whispered Mary's name. Every corner had held a memory too painful to examine. Here, the silence was clean, empty, but not haunted. On the 8th day, a letter arrived. I recognized Elizabeth's handwriting immediately, the same neat script she'd developed as a medical student, designed to be legible on prescriptions and patient notes. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Dear Dad, I hope this letter finds you settling into your new home. I've been thinking about you constantly since we said goodbye at the cottage. The drive back to Manchester felt longer than usual, perhaps, because I was leaving behind something important. Not just a building, but a piece of who our family used to be. I want to visit. Not out of guilt, though I carry plenty of that. Not out of obligation, though I feel that too. I want to visit because I miss you. I miss the father who taught me to identify constellations from the Lighthouse gallery. I miss the man who held my hand when I failed my first medical exam and told me that failure was just another word for learning. I know I disappeared for 3 years. I know excuses about hospital shifts and patient emergencies don't justify the silence. Mum's letter made that painfully clear. She wrote that I had become so focused on saving strangers' lives that I'd forgotten to be present in my own family's life. She was right. Grace has been texting the group chat, the one with just us 5 sisters who stayed. She's proposing we all visit you in August, if you'll have us. A week on Sky. Together. No agendas, no arguments about money or trusts or the past. Just family. Trying to remember how to be family again. Please say yes. Please give us another chance. Your daughter, Elizabeth. I read the letter 3 times before setting it down on the kitchen table. Through the window, the Quean Mountains stood unchanged, indifferent to the small dramas of human hearts. But inside my chest, something shifted, a door that had been locked for years, creaking open just a crack. I found stationery in one of the unpacked boxes, cream paper Mary had bought years ago for special correspondence. I sat at the kitchen table as afternoon light slanted through the window and began to write. Dear Elizabeth, your letter arrived like sunshine after a long winter. Yes, come to Sky. Bring your sisters, all of them who wish to come. Grace, Rosemary, Beatrice, Charlotte, even Harriet. If she's ready. I won't pretend the past 3 years didn't happen. I won't pretend your mother's death and your absence didn't leave scars that still ache on cold mornings. But I've learned something in these weeks of Scottish silence. Carrying anger is exhausting. Forgiveness isn't about pretending wounds don't exist. It's about choosing not to let them define the future. Your mother's final letter to me said that love doesn't need a container. I'm beginning to understand what she meant. The cottage is gone. But what we built there as a family, as father and daughters, that can be rebuilt anywhere, even here, on this windswept island, at the edge of the world. Come in August. We'll walk the coastal paths together. I'll show you the lighthouse at Nice Point. It reminds me of Start Point, though the light here feels different, softer somehow, more forgiving. Tell your sisters. Tell them the door is open. With love, Dad. I sealed the letter and walked to the Portree post office. The envelope pressed against my heart. Healing had begun. They came in August, as promised, not all at once, but in waves, like the tide returning to a shore it had abandoned. Elizabeth arrived first, driving up from the Mallaig ferry on a Tuesday afternoon with her 8-year-old daughter Annie buckled into the passenger seat. I hadn't seen my granddaughter in nearly 2 years. Hospital shifts, school schedules, the usual excuses that had somehow become acceptable. She'd grown so much I barely recognized her. Long brown hair cascading past her shoulders like her grandmother's had once done. Curious hazel eyes that studied everything with quiet intensity. Grandpa Bobby. Annie launched herself from the car before Elizabeth had even switched off the engine. Small arms wrapped around my waist, squeezing with surprising strength for such a tiny person. Mummy says you live where dragons used to be. Are there still dragons hiding in the mountains? Only in the Quelan's, I said, lifting her up despite my protesting back and creaking knees. They sleep deep inside the rocks. On quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you can hear them snoring. Elizabeth watched us embrace, with tears streaming silently down her cheeks. No words were needed between us. Some reconciliations happen in silence, in the space between heartbeats, in the simple act of showing up. Grace and Rosemary arrived together 3 days later, having shared the long drive from Cardiff and Plymouth in Rosemary's modest Fiat. Grace looked different, somehow lighter, less burdened by invisible weights. The secret she'd carried for 3 years had finally been released into the open air, and without that crushing weight pressing down on her shoulders, she seemed to stand taller. I brought Mum's recipe book, Rosemary announced excitedly, holding up a battered notebook filled with Mary's familiar handwriting. The same neat schoolteacher's script that had labeled Christmas boxes and written trust documents. I thought maybe we could cook her lamb stew together. The one she always made for special occasions when we were children. That evening, 5 of us crowded into my small kitchen. Elizabeth chopping carrots and potatoes with surgical precision. Grace measuring dried herbs and spices into small bowls. Rosemary directing operations from the recipe book. Like a general commanding troops, Annie stirring the bubbling pot with exaggerated seriousness and a wooden spoon almost as tall as herself. I sat at the worn kitchen table watching my family work together in harmonious chaos, and for the first time and longer than I could remember, the cottage didn't feel empty. It felt like home. Charlotte came alone on Saturday morning, arriving by taxi from Portree because she'd never learned to drive. Alistair had always insisted on chauffeuring her everywhere, controlling even that small freedom. The divorce had been finalized in July, after months of bitter negotiations. She'd lost the Edinburgh townhouse and half her savings, but she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: herself. "I've taken a leave of absence from the bank," Charlotte told me as we walked the coastal path toward Niced Point, the wind whipping her blonde hair free from its usual corporate perfection. 6 months to figure out who I actually am without the job title, without Alistair's expectations, without the life I carefully constructed to impress people I don't even particularly like. "And who are you discovering beneath all those layers?" She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, not the practiced corporate expression I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Someone who likes hiking more than board meetings. Someone who can cook her own meals instead of ordering expensive takeaway every night. Someone who misses her family far more than she ever allowed herself to admit." Beatrice arrived last, flying into Inverness from Lisbon and taking 3 separate buses across the Scottish Highlands to finally reach Portree. She'd sold her professional camera equipment and cancelled her travel blog indefinitely. The eternal wanderer was finally ready to stop running from herself. "I'm moving back to England," she announced over dinner on her first night, surprising everyone into momentary silence. "Bristol, probably. Close enough to visit family regularly, but far enough to maintain my own independent life. I want to try staying in one place long enough to actually learn my neighbors' names for once." "What will you do for work?" Elizabeth asked practically. "Photography still, but different this time around. Portraits instead of landscapes. Real human faces instead of pretty scenic views." Beatrice glanced at me across the candlelit table. "Mum's letter said I photographed the world to avoid photographing myself. I think it's finally time I turned the camera around and faced what I've been running from." The week unfolded like a gift being slowly, carefully unwrapped. Morning walks along cliff paths with different combinations of daughters. Afternoon tea and competitive card games that stretched into evening as the light lingered in the Scottish summer sky. Shared meals where conversation flowed naturally instead of feeling forced through awkward silences. Annie became the bridge connecting us all together. Children possess an extraordinary ability to dissolve adult awkwardness, demanding presence in the current moment rather than dwelling endlessly on past grievances and old wounds. She insisted on visiting the Lighthouse at Niced Point, and all 5 of us made the trek together, 3 generations of Thornton women, plus 1 weathered lighthouse keeper, walking single file along the narrow cliff path above churning seas. "Is this where you worked, Grandpa?" Annie asked, staring up at the white tower with wonder. "Not this exact one, sweetheart, but one very similar, far away in Devon. I kept that light burning faithfully for 40 years. Why did you do it?" I knelt down to her level, aging joints, protesting loudly. "Because ships get hopelessly lost in the dark, sweetheart. And when you're truly lost, sometimes all you need is one steady light to guide you safely home." Annie considered this with 8-year-old solemnity, her small face serious. "Like Mummy was lost? And Auntie Grace? And everyone else?" I looked up at my daughters standing behind her, Elizabeth crying again, Grace nodding slowly, Charlotte and Rosemary holding hands, Beatrice capturing this precious moment on her phone. "Yes, sweetheart. Exactly like that." On the final evening, we gathered together on my small porch, watching the sunset paint the ancient Quillins in breathtaking shades of gold and deepening purple. "Same time next year?" Elizabeth asked softly. "Same time every year," I promised. "For as long as the light keeps burning." December 21st came around again, as it always does, the longest night of the year, returning like an old friend bearing difficult memories. But this year was different. This year, I wasn't alone. I woke before dawn in Skyfall Cottage, habit still refusing to release its 40-year grip. Through the bedroom window, the Isle of Skye lay wrapped in winter darkness, the Quillen Mountains invisible against the black sky. Somewhere out there, the lighthouse at Neist Point was sweeping its beam across cold waters, guiding ships I would never see. I made tea the way I always do. Earl Grey, splash of milk, no sugar. Mary's ritual, now mine. The kitchen was warm from the wood-burning stove I'd lit the night before, and the blue-rimmed china cups her grandmother's legacy sat waiting on the shelf like patient friends. 5 plates this year. Not 7. Perhaps never 7 again. Victoria had sent a solicitor's letter in October, formally severing all family ties and demanding I never contact her again. The legal challenge against Mary's trust had failed spectacularly in court, and her pride couldn't survive the public humiliation. My eldest daughter had chosen anger over reconciliation, and I had learned painfully that some doors close forever. Harriet remained a ghost. Occasional Instagram posts showed her paintings selling in Bristol galleries, her artistic career finally flourishing. But she never called, never wrote, never acknowledged the family she'd left behind. Grace still sent birthday messages that went unanswered. Perhaps one day the door would open. Perhaps not. I had stopped waiting, but 5 daughters had returned. 5 was enough. 5 was a miracle. Elizabeth arrived first, as she had in August, but this time without Annie. The little one was spending Christmas Eve with her father in Manchester, custody arrangements being what they are. My daughter looked tired from the long drive, but peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Happy solstice, Dad." She kissed my cheek and pressed a wrapped gift into my hands. "Don't open it until tonight." Grace and Rosemary came together again, their sisterhood rekindled after years of distant politeness. Rosemary had adopted a rescue dog since August, a scruffy terrier named Biscuit who immediately claimed the warmest spot by the stove and refused to move. "He's not very well trained," Rosemary admitted as Biscuit ignored her commands entirely. "But he's very good at unconditional love. I'm learning from him." Charlotte arrived mid-afternoon, looking healthier than I'd ever seen her. 6 months away from investment banking had erased the permanent tension from her shoulders. She'd taken up pottery. Of all things, her hands, once trained only for keyboards and handshakes, now knew the feeling of wet clay spinning on a wheel. "I made you something," she said, presenting a small ceramic bowl glazed in swirling blues and greens. "It's not perfect. The edges are uneven, and there's a crack on one side. But I made it myself, with my own hands. And that feels more valuable than anything I ever bought." Beatrice was last, bursting through the door at 5:30 with snowflakes melting in her wild hair. She'd driven up from Bristol in her newly purchased second-hand car, the first vehicle she'd ever owned, a declaration of her commitment to staying in one place. "Sorry I'm late." The A9 was murder. "But I brought wine and I brought this." She held up a framed photograph, which I took in August, and which I want you to have. The photograph showed all of us at Neist Point. 5 daughters, 1 granddaughter, 1 old lighthouse keeper, silhouetted against a setting sun. We were laughing at something Annie had said, faces turned toward each other rather than the camera. It was imperfect, slightly blurred, horizon tilted, Rosemary's eyes half closed. But it was real. It was us. "It's beautiful," I managed, throat tight. "It's family," Beatrice corrected gently. Same thing. At 6 o'clock, precisely the exact moment the test had failed 1 year ago, we sat down together at my small dining table. 5 plates instead of 7. 5 glasses of wine raised in a toast. "To Mum," Grace said quietly, "who saw all of this coming and loved us anyway." "To Mum," we echoed. The meal was simple. Roast chicken, vegetables from the Portree greengrocer, potatoes crispy with goose fat the way Mary used to make them. Nothing fancy, everything meaningful. Conversation flowed like water finding its natural course. Charlotte described her pottery classes and the unexpected joy of creating something imperfect. Rosemary shared stories from the veterinary clinic. Animals saved, animals lost, the strange privilege of being present for both. Grace talked about her students in Cardiff, the ones who reminded her why teaching mattered. Elizabeth updated us on Annie's latest obsessions and her own tentative steps toward work-life balance. Beatrice showed us photographs from her new portrait series, Faces of Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. After dinner, I retrieved Mary's final letter from my bedside drawer, the one I'd found in the grandfather clock. I read it aloud, my voice steady despite the tears. Love doesn't need a container. It goes wherever you go. 5 daughters sat in silence, absorbing their mother's wisdom. 1 year after her test had transformed everything. She knew. Charlotte whispered finally. She knew. Some of us would fail, and some would return. She planned for both. She hoped for the best, I said, and prepared for the worst. That's what love does. At midnight, we walked together to the cliff top above Portree Harbor. The sky had cleared, revealing more stars than any city dweller ever sees, thousands upon thousands of ancient lights burning across the darkness. The winter solstice, the longest night, the moment when the world tips back toward the sun. Make a wish, Rosemary said, pointing at a shooting star streaking across the blackness. I closed my eyes and wished for nothing. Everything I needed was standing beside me. When I opened my eyes, Elizabeth was holding out the gift she'd brought. Open it now, Dad. It's time. Inside the wrapping was a small wooden box. Inside the box was a brass compass, old, weathered, clearly antique. Engraved on the back were words I recognized immediately as Mary's. For Bobby, so you always find your way home. No matter how dark the night, the light is always there. Love, Mary. She had bought it years ago, Elizabeth explained. Hidden it with instructions to give it to me when the family found its way back. I held the compass in my trembling hands, watching the needle swing and settle, pointing north. The longest night was ending. Dawn was coming, and for the first time in years, I was ready to meet it. If you're listening to this story, I want to ask you something. When did you last call your parents? Your children? Your siblings? The people who matter most, who somehow always get pushed to tomorrow because today is too busy. Don't wait for a frozen bank account to remind you what's important. Don't wait for a funeral to say the words you should have said years ago. Don't wait for a test you might fail. Pick up the phone. Send the message. Make the visit. The light is always burning, but someone has to choose to come home.